Today is the 19th, and we're at 3:30 p.m. Okay, Ron, if you'd just like to go ahead and tell us a bit about your early childhood, where you were born, that sort of stuff.
Well, I'll start off where my mother began. She was born in Denmark, and Dad descended from a Scottish, Irish, English line, and they came to Queensland via boat through the Mediterranean around the top of Cape and went ashore in Pyalbo, where there was a wharf where the ship would take on coal because of a mine there. But the point was that they emigrated because the father was hoping to join the gold rush, which was happening at Mount Perry, west of Bundaberg. Unfortunately, he was killed during that search when he was riding a horse and passed Tula under a branch that killed him. Anyway, that's later on into that family. That's where I come into it. And I was born with my twin sister in 1922 in a Gladstone hospital where we arrived 3 months early. And even today, that's remarkable. They were coming down from North Queensland in that time because Mum was pregnant with, they knew was twins, and going to go down to Pyalba where they had originally started their life because Grandma there was a midwife. Anyway, they had to put into Gladstone where we were born. Now that starts my life, and Maeva and I, that's my twin, have been very close over the years, and others were born behind me, and all that family now are no longer with me. And so my life and what I did in it starts. Maeva and I, as twins, grew up beside the railway because my dad was a station master, and it took us to quite a few towns because to get promotion, whenever a vacancy occurred, he took it up. So we ended up in places like Tully, Redlinch near Cairns, Ilfracombe near Longreach, Herberton up in the country, and till arrived at Kilcoy, where I finished my schooling at age 16. And that brings up the prospect of what I have to achieve, because on the very last day, as a teacher, a male, who said to me, when we weren't doing anything in particular, "Hickey, what are you going to do now?" And I said, "I'm going to fly." And he said, "Oh, you'll never be a pilot." And that brings up that question. Teachers should always encourage, not discourage, because I went away and at a later time I became a pilot. And because of him, or not because of him, but when I was sitting in a friendship, passengers coming on board at a town, Mackay, who should walk out but my old teacher. And I invited him through the hostess up to the cockpit. Anyway, he preferred not to remember me, but I pointed out to him that you said I would never be a pilot, and here I am. Anyway, that's the search. It brings me back quite a few years later. But at Kilcoy, at 16, I did a number of things sitting in class that day where I made a commitment to many things. One was to look after my parents. The other was to stop being left-handed, which I did, and many other things I would do. I'd keep my religious faith. I would try and be a good person, and one day I would fly. And as I've mentioned before, Dad worked as a station master in the railway, and we were always living beside the railway. The train practically went past our door. But Dad, after we were born, moved to a town, Tully, up in North Queensland, the centre of the sugarcane industry. And during the time we were there in the 1928 flood, we had to be helped out of our house because the water had risen up just short of our floorboards and we were on high stumps. And we had to be carried by a gang of men across the bridge of the river that was in flood and flowing over the bridge. So we were doing pretty well when we safely made the town. Now those little incidents happened at different times, and Tully at that time was a frontier town because the railway went no further. It was being built at that time just north of Tully and going on to Cairns. And Dad tells some stories of incidents. A lady called into our house one day and said to Dad, "There's a man over in that shed over there and he's sitting in the same position for the last 3 days." And Dad went over and he was certainly a very unmovable man. He'd been shot and he was dead. Another day Dad went out with a friend in his utility truck to pick up some people out of town, and actually what they were picking up was another man who had been murdered, and they put him in the back and put a Hessian over him, and on the way into town a couple of men thumbed a road. So they picked him up and they sat down on this Hessian, and one of them was feeling along and it was a bit strange, and till he realised he was sitting on a body. Anyway, that's just some of the things that happen in these out-of-the-way places. But we did have a holiday over on an island, Dunk Island, which is off Hinchinbrook, and I can remember to get onto that, we were going down the Herbert River, which was the one that had flooded before, and the boat was there and we were putting all our gear on board, and it might seem trivial, but I was a bit disappointed when Dad said, "Have you got a knife?" to the man doing the loading, and he said yes, and he opened up the blade of a multi-blade thing and threw it to him, and Dad didn't quite catch it and it fell into the river. And that was a sad thing to me. Beautiful knife, unretrievable. But the Dunk Island experience was wonderful, and at one stage we run out of necessary ingredients to make bread, and Dad and my eldest brother rowed across to the next island. And I was wrong, we were on Allison Island, and it was Dunk Island that they rowed across to. When they landed there, they went ashore and they had landed on a quicksand beach. They had to run very quickly and to get around to the other side where people lived. They picked them up, went around, picked up the boat they'd left and took them back to the Dunk Island. I remember those things because on the island there wasn't much to do except joy life, and that's a few of the points there. Dad later on left Tully and moved up the new railway line to Redlands, just outside of Cairns. And of course, when we got to Ilfracombe, that's a different business altogether to living in North Queensland. North Queensland was beautiful, plenty of rain, lots of cane fields, a lot of Chinese working on farms because they originally came out to Australia to work on the Palmer gold fields north of Cairns, and at that stage the gold had petered out and they were now growing vegetables and fruit and all the rest of it. Anyway, by the time we got to Ilfracombe, that had changed. Miles after miles of open country, very few trees, grass missing because they had a drought, and in the 2 years we lived there, we only saw it shower a few times. But when Dad heard it, when we were released or were going out into that territory, he bought up, because he thought it was a lot more primitive than that actually was, and we loaded up with all the tin food we could get, and all the different jams and tin peaches and the whole lot of it. But among the jams that he had the majority of was quince, which none of us loved at all. But anyway, we got to Ilfracombe, and then from there, or I might mention that while we were at Ilfracombe, the Qantas was taking delivery of a 4-engine biplane and from a DH-84, and it was on a flight from England to Sydney via the usual stops and the many stops, and they had previously overnighted at Longreach, and next morning they're taking off. They had crashed and all been killed about 18 miles out of Ilfracombe. A beam of the just tripped down, and Dad was able to go out with the policeman, local policeman, the following day, and the bodies had been removed, and that was my first touch of an aeroplane. It was a very fragile aircraft at the best of times, and it was a complete wreck. But I had a piece of aluminium from some part of the aircraft in my kit for the years afterwards, and again, that was my first touch of an aeroplane. While I was at school in Ilfracombe, the school was on the outskirts of the half-dozen towns of the people living there, and an aeroplane, a biplane again, a single engine, privately owned, landed in the just outside the school fence. It didn't matter, that was just level ground, and there he was. And all the kids left their class and raced out to the fence, and the pilot got out and he dropped his passenger off, and he said, "Nobody touched that plane." So we were kept in, but that was the closest I got to an operating aeroplane. He took off soon afterwards, and away it went. But to me, I'm on my way towards flying sometime. And after Ilfracombe, we moved to Kilcoy, down west of Brisbane. It was a town of quite a fair size, and Dad, of course, was the station master there, and I went to the local school. Mind you, in the past we had missed the schooling in one or two places, so by the time I finished what was primary school, scholarship, I was 16 years old when normally you would have been 12, because when you went to a new town, a new school, the first thing they did was put you down a class, because you weren't covering what was covered there then. And so that's where I get to the point on my last day at school, when I turned 16, I said to the teacher when he asked me, "Hickey, what are you going to do?" And I said, "I'm going to fly." And he said, "Ha ha, you'll never fly." That 2 years I did, till we left there. Actually, we left when I was 18, because 2 years I worked for a carpenter, I worked for a painter, a plumber, in a butcher shop, in a blacksmith shop, ploughed paddocks for farmers, and once worked on the railway line with a gang of men to restore the track which had been washed out at a flood. And that was an experience, because I'm still only a boy, and they were muscle men, so much so that when they got to the site and the train would pull into a quarry where the tracks had been laid, the trucks weren't proper trucks for carrying that sort of load, and you had to shovel the rock and stuff off the ground to the truck lip over your shoulders into that. They would put a 4-gallon tin which carried kerosene originally, cut the top out of, put that on a fire arranged over an open fire between stones, and it was part of my job to keep the timber burning under that. But they shocked me here because immediately it was boiling, they'd come along with their tea, and all of them put a handful of tea into that. And you could imagine what that was like by the time they knocked off. But they would go there for a cup of tea all over the day while they were doing that job. And I ended up with a lump under my arm as big as a cricket ball from throwing that stuff up. And but I stuck it out, and the men didn't have much conversation. They were hard workers. You'd load this train, it would go up the line, and then you shoved it off. And then you'd hop over and pack it in onto the truck, go back and get another load. I did this for 14 days, and fortunately we got the truck open in that time, or I'd have probably died there. And Dad got me a job in the goods shed where I checked the loading of the trains into the shed and signed people out as they picked it up. But that was interesting, and after that we moved to Monto, which is up inland. You went out through from Maribor to Biggin to Gaindler to up finally to Monto. That line went on then to Gladstone, but it mainly ran out then because Monto was the first place that grew cotton, and plus a little bit of gold mining and so on. But while we were at Kilcoy and I was doing all these different, Monto, while we were doing these sort of jobs, a train, well, first the war started, and Dad was one of the few people in Ilfracombe at the time that had a radio, and so the war started to impinge on our lives. Anyway, he got posted to Monto and we moved up there, and sit by the radio every night and listen to the news in Europe. And it started to interest my mum in particular because her folks were born in Denmark. They were now occupied by Germany, and so much so that my elder brother decided he would like to join the Air Force, and he cleared that with Mum and Dad because they hated the thought of war, but they gave him the clearance, and that was in 1941 and 1940. And the other thing he used to watch on his radio was cricket. And of course you couldn't watch it, but you could hear the ball. And we learned later that every time they said, Bradman's hit that ball, it'd be the bloke transmitter would hit it on the table, and you'd listen to this all night. And of course, people all around came along to listen to that. But on top of that was the war news. And into Monto, a year after Dudley had joined the Air Force recruiting train steamed into Mondo. It had about 4 carriages, half a dozen experts on aviation, and a staff to look after them, to cook their meals, and they set their recruiting part of it up in the town hall, where I went over to Dad the following morning and I said I want to join the Air Force, and he said, ask your mother. So I quickly ran over to my house, which is close by, and said to Mama, I want to join the Air Force. She said, ask your father. So I ran back to Dad and said, it's okay. He said, right, I'll come up to the recruiting place at the town hall with you. And that was nice. I was a shy country boy, and I was going to be a little bit out of my depth. I wasn't particularly well educated, and so we went in, and I had to a partial medical. They would later do a proper one in Brisbane, and had to pass a lot of tests. Anyway, I got a pass in all the aptitude tests I had to do, and they said, right, you're now a recruit in the Air Force. We'll give you a lot of books you can brush up on, and you'll probably be called up within the year. So I went back. Dad was a proud man because his eldest son had succeeded, and I spent a lot of time reading the books that gave how the Air Force worked. Had to learn who the various ranks were, and a lot of stuff. And he wanted a little bit more than my education covered, which was a bit of algebra and advanced mathematics. And I was working for a blacksmith at the time, so I did have some money, and I hired the local school teacher who I knew to give me 2 nights a week brushing up on things, and I paid him for it. In the meantime, I spent my time digging trenches behind the convent school where I hadn't gone to school, but I was digging zigzag trenches because of the unlikelihood of the Japanese bombing the place, which is a bit of a joke really, but I did that. Anyway, that started me then on my career in the Air Force, because a year later, 1942, I was called up to go into initial training school, which was at Sandgate, and on a 3-month course. I went down to Brisbane. I did a medical examination in front of a number of people. I passed all that, and one of they were senior officers in the Air Force, said to me, of course you've got a brother in the Air Force? And I said yes. And anyway, next stop was going to be down to Sandgate, 3 months to be in the Air Force at Sandgate. In 1942, the Air Force called me up. I went down to Brisbane, I went through another medical, and then down to Sandgate where the initial training school was set up. It was right on the waterfront just before where you go over the Hornibrook Highway. out in front they had reclaimed land with a rock face, which was the parade ground in front of the station, the Air Force station. It was a muddy waterfront. You wouldn't go paddling there by choice. But the first day we were there, and all the huts were built of corrugated iron on the walls on its side and corrugated on the roof. And would have been the whole base built in a hurry. And the course ahead of us had been delayed a little bit, and they had a couple of days still to do. So we ended up in tents on the edge of another parade ground for a couple of days. This introduction into the world of other men and the practices outside of my youthful life took a little bit. Like, living in the tent was good because it had a timber floor and you had the tent to yourself. But the toilet facilities were the big corrugated iron, hot concrete floor with no divisions in it, but it was bigger than 4 times this space. On that wall there were toilets without a seat on them, because the philosophy was the cold china was supposed to decrease the likelihood of catching something off it. But the point was it was public. On the other wall there were the wash basins with mirrors, and they were in sight of all that. And up in that quarter was showers along the roof, and you all showered together. Somebody could be using the toilet, and I found it a little bit hard to get used to. I would have snuck around the corner. But anyway, we lived in those tents for about 2 weeks doing sort of parade ground stuff and marching and so on. And then on the first day we went further and got our uniforms. Up till then we had barely got more than a pair of pants, underpants and a battle jacket. And we're all standing outside one of these corrugated iron huts, and with a big window in it, and the peeps all inside the handing out clothes according to your size. And it was a beautiful day when an aircraft, an American fighter aircraft, an Air Cobra, which was a single engine of course, but it was unique. It had the engine behind the pilot, and the drive shaft went up through there, between your legs, to the propeller in the front. And through that shaft there was a cannon could fire. The difference between it and many others, it was a tricycle undercarriage. And later in the war I learned that they used it extensively up in the Aleutian Islands, up north of Japan and west of Canada. But this day, this fighter comes over, which we'd never seen before. It's got a smart aleck amateur in the cockpit. They were taking off from Bald Hills, and he couldn't resist the tension. The Air Force people down there. So he comes over and he's right on his side as he goes over the top and out over the water. The only thing, we all broke that group and raced around the end of the shed so we could see. He touches the wing down in the water and it goes good, good, good. And the pilot's killed and the whole base, I think, except me raced out in the mud to get to the aircraft. And of course, they could only take him out of the cockpit. He was dead. And so that was quite an introduction to the flying world. We were fitted out with everything we would need in the Air Force at this stage, and we had to learn what we should wear and how we behaved, how we saluted, and so on. And a couple of days later we were back to get a few other things, when another smart Alec buzzed the place, but then climbed up into the clouds, and the cloud was about 3,000 feet, and you could hear he did some manoeuvres up there, but next moment you hear the whine of an aircraft, and he comes out of the cloud and he's on a spin. But he managed to cover from that, pull the nose up before he went into the water, and back up into the cloud, which didn't help him at all, because he's now on instrument and barely control of the aircraft, and he came out of the cloud again and spun into the mud out in front. Again, what an introduction to the flying world. We learned that the American Air Force, just before we got there, the tracks were still in the ground that was on the other side of the base we had been camping on, and the tracks were in the soft ground that had been reclaimed from the sea. A bomber of theirs lost on the outskirts of Brisbane, and not sure where the airfield is, did a landing on it. And it was just enough to get down, a flying fortress. Unfortunately, we didn't get there in time to see it take off. But the American military on the spot pretty soon. You weren't allowed to take cameras, you weren't allowed to go near it. And anyway, it successfully took off at minimum weight and enough fuel to get to Archerfield, and so he did. So again, we are now in the Air Force. We've seen the people who've been in the war at the present time. I found the time at Sandgate very, very interesting. We did classes in various different buildings, and there were 36 of us in each one of the huts we were living in, and that was 2 rows down each side with a wide passageway up the middle. All had facilities of a bed, something beside the bed, and wardrobes out in the entrance hall. And at a certain time you had lights out. And I'll say this, might sound a bit interesting to a good Catholic. When it came to a lights out call, they would say 15 minutes and the lights go out. And in front of all those men, I would kneel beside my bed and say my prayers. And in that room, and nobody moved till I finished. Nobody pulled my leg, nobody ridiculed me, and they lived with that. A man there, Stan Hinch, I became very close friends with. He was also a Catholic, but he told me later, years later, something he'd been wanting to tell me. He came to live up at Coolum, and I would go and visit him. And you can cancel out at this stage, well, I let you take it out. And when I went up to visit him one night, he said, there's something I want to tell you. And I wanted to tell you years ago. And I wanted to kneel beside my bed, and I didn't have the guts to do it. When he got to Bundaberg, he didn't make it because he was a class above me in his brains, but his reflexes couldn't keep up with flying. So he became my friend after the war. But it was pressure every day in that time. You went from this class to that class, and they had hanging from the ceiling, and all of them, different model aircraft of the aircraft that were flying at that time. Something like 100 of them in the final room, where eventually you would be sat down and you had to pass an aircraft recognition test. The lights were dimmed, and you had to, in a brief flash of this aircraft appearing on the screen, you had to write down what it was. And there was 100 of them. I got one wrong, and many others. And we were the ones, after other tests, who went on to be pilots, while some of them went on to be navigators, others to be radio operators because of their mental abilities, but reflexes were the thing that we were looking for. And there was a lot to learn for me. I'm not shy of saying that I entered the world outside of school poorly educated. The bulk of what I knew is what I did in those schools and what I read from books, because I was keen to read. I learned a lot about aeroplanes in those. I had made a model airplane of a DC-3 or DC-2 it was then, carved out of wood, and but I was lagging in a lot of stuff. But I came out of Sandgate with a pass for pilot, and I didn't fail in any class, and I learned a lot. And one of the things was I was determined to learn a loss. And we got the odd break, went up to Monto a couple of times by train, and stayed at Stan Hinch's place in Brisbane a couple of times. And it was a very interesting time. And 3 months later, we either graduated with a pass for pilot or navigator or radio operator, and others who would go to a gunnery school. After that, I didn't get to know those people again, because they went over in different courses and by different routes. And I just jump forward there, that actually when we got to the point at Church Broughton where we now were qualified pilots without a crew, we entered a big hangar where a lot of other Air Force people were. They were wearing the wings of a navigator or a radio operator or a gunner, and they were all in this room, and only one or two you knew. And the big brass up on the stage said to the pilots, pick your crew. And that's how we got the people we flew with. I walked around, and I don't know by what qualifications I picked them, but I picked people probably I would be comfortable with, And when we had all the crew in front of me gathered around, without the flight engineer that would come later when you got to Halifax. And I welcomed them and said, now you've got the choice of accepting me as your pilot, as your captain, and you are in my crew unless you back out. And one thing I want to say to you, you will have heard the stories, as I have, that some crews didn't go to the target. And I said, we are going to every target. Now, if you don't like that, I'll find somewhere else. So they all joined me. And we were good friends. We ended up together and we enjoyed life together. They all came to my wedding except one because he couldn't make it. And they were part of my life. 2 of them went out to India with me, a navigator radio operator, and the others had to do a second course with somebody else. Anyway, that's the story up to Sandgate. Now at Sandgate, we also did a little bit of gunnery on a rifle range, and we also did guard duty, which is 4 hours on, 2 hours on and 4 hours off. Everybody had to do it at some time while we were there, around the perimeter of Sandgate. There was no hazards in that. The best and worst that could happen is somebody want to be smart, and that's the way it went. And before we left Sandgate, we had to get a series of injections for tetanus and cholera and all these. And they had a small hospital section, which I ended up in for a couple of days with a bad throat, and everybody got it eventually. And that's the first time I ever heard the death rattle. There was an old man in the room with 2 beds, and I was in one and he was the other, and unconsciously didn't know I was there, but I was woken by this terrible noise one night, and the staff came running from all directions. They didn't sift me, they just wheeled his bed out of the way. As it turned out, he did die that night. But the other occasion we had to line up at the hospital, and then we all had to do it. The long line of the 200, they had a doctor there and a doctor there, another sister there and another nurse there, and you went down this line. Now the first 2 gave you your first lot. They unscrewed the syringe, and with your needles in your arm you went to the next 2. They screwed it on and they did that. They did that 4 times, but during that time half of us men fainted. The sight of that needle sticking out was too much for them. But anyway, that was part of the last stages at Sandgate. Now what I haven't told you is at Sandgate we were 27 corps. And when we finished, we had to go to Amberley for 2 weeks because Narendra, where we would be going, wasn't ready for us. And we were put up there, and some people could visit relatives around about. Then we boarded a train, and it was crowded. They didn't put quite enough carriages on, and we stayed in that train from Brisbane to Sydney to Narendra. And the night was a bit long, but they pulled up at stations that had food place and you'd have a meal off the train. Anyway, we ended up in Narrandera, which is an air base in southwestern New South Wales, where we would start our first flying in a Tiger Moth. The Tiger Moth was a biplane, that's two wings, one above the other, single engine, an open cockpit, where the instructor sat in the cockpit in front and you flew it from the standard cockpit at the back, and you spoke into a mouthpiece. And it was an exciting time because now you are going to be a pilot. Well, at least you're going to fly. And there's a long course involved. I think we were there about 3 months. And every now and then you could get a visit into the town of Narrandera. And that was good for me because I'm a Catholic and I would go into church. And the priest there was Father O'Brien, who wrote the poetry book Around the Bowery Log. And he gave me the book and he signed it. And that's quite a history. And at Narrandera, I had no difficulty, difficulty in being smooth about something or doing something right until you got used to the aircraft. And we flew often, and I enjoyed every minute of that. We did a couple of cross countries that took us down towards the snowy mountains and across and back home. And I only know one pilot who was scrubbed after that because he didn't do what he was told to do. Much the same as my younger brother who down there on one of those training flights landed beside a farmhouse near the girl he had got to know, and the instructor flew over at that time, and that took him out of flying. Anyway, I had nothing difficult. I had still to get myself out of a country boy. The report, I learned later, gave me pass, average, but needs to cultivate more dash. I accepted that because that described my situation, and I'm slowly getting out of that. I'm certain that when I blew up, beat up Mondo at a later date, and the Air Force got to know about it, that did me no harm whatsoever. Because they liked the fact that I had enough guts now to do these things, and I had survived it. That's my opinion now, long after I left Thunderbird. Anyway, after staying in Amberley 2 weeks, we went down to Narrandera, and that was nothing but flying almost every day, with some classes, some silly games we had to play at night, 2 teams in the middle of a forest that came up to the field, and fairly tight packed with bush and clutter. You had to demonstrate the ability to find the one crew that were a prisoner in the centre and do something about that. And that was a lot of fun at night, but it was just a way of breaking up the monotony. But anyway, in recent times I've learned that one of those Tiger Moths I flew way back in 1942 crashed off Fraser Island on a joy flight a few months back. And it was still flying. No doubt after a lot of work's been done on it, but I believe there's a few others. But that's a long time for those aircraft to be flying. And I enjoyed the whole stay at Narrandera. We got to flying 2 night circuits. One with the instructor, one solo, but that's as far as the training went at that time. On the one of the blokes, and we went out to a satellite field to do that, where they had us 2 rows of lights, and we went out on a truck, and we had a drum of fuel on board, and we could extend the time there. And this bloke dived on the truck on his solo flight. His wheel hit the drum that was standing on the back of the truck and catapulted the drum into a crew who had an injured leg out of it. But he finished his flying there that night. So these things can happen always. And after succeeding at Narrandera and getting a pass of average, needs to cultivate more dash, I joined with all the other blokes who came through, minus the 2 who'd lost the time, and we went down by train again all the way to Bundaberg. And that was a long, monotonous journey because you had to change trains in Brisbane. And we arrived there to be told that because the flight before us was delayed, we'd be doing guard duty for a month. And our group number now was 28 instead of 27. We were just going to arrive overseas late. And that it was a terrible time. 2 hours out around the perimeter of a large area with bush outside, and you had to parade until you met the next bloke, and he paraded, and there's a danger one of you shoot one of your mates. But anyway, we're carrying 303s, and we did a lot of that, and it was an experience. And nobody failed. My mate Stan Hinch, who was still in the course, had a motorbike. He had poor sight at night. I would sit on the pillion, he had the licence, he would ride the bike, and I'd tell him where to go. Well, on completing our course at Bundaberg, where those of us who had succeeded received our wings and got the rank of sergeant. And we were then, by various routes, trucked to the Brisbane River, where there was an American troop ship berthed. They had brought troops out for the war north of Queensland. And that ship was to take us to America. The interior of the ship, the Willarday Holbrook was its name, was bunks had been built all over the holes and could take a couple of 100 men or even more. We sailed down the river late in the afternoon on the 5th of May 1943. And as we passed the wharf on our left side, as we went down the river, we saw the Centaur hospital ship, on which the women, all the sisters, were in their white uniforms and red capes, were waving. All the ships in harbour were tooting their horns. In wartime it's traditional to do that. What they're saying is, Godspeed. because the ocean we were going out into was full of Japanese submarines. And to protect us, we had one destroyer for the first 100 miles. We sailed out of Moreton Bay with Moreton Island on our right, and night came down as I sat there at the rear of the ship watching the coast of Australia disappear, and I wondered, would I see it again? And as we sat down to a meal that night, we were told we would have to do certain duties while on ship, and they were allocated according to the volunteers. And my mates and I elected to do kitchen duties for the journey. And that was nothing really. You got up earlier than the others, you ate better, you set the tables, you cleared them, put it all in a big washing machine that took everything, and then you had the rest of the time off. You did it 3 times a day. The others did duties such as manning guns and a watch for submarines. And as it was a hostile nation, at the time the war was being fought in the Solomons and Guadalcanal, and both navies, the American and the Japs, were sinking ships and drowning lots of men. The number of ships sunk off the western side of the Solomons made them call the bay there Ironclad Bay. Anyway, we then sailed a long way south to avoid all that activity, and it was so cold some nights we knew we were south because there was ice on the deck and on the rails. The trip took 3 weeks until we berthed at San Francisco. And learning after the war, 2 days before we got to San Francisco, this hospital ship Centaur had been sunk off Moreton Island. On arriving at San Francisco, we entered the port under the Golden Gate Bridge, and on the wharfs on the far side from the main city, there was a train waiting with Pullman coaches. We went, as soon as they unloaded our gear, straight on board, allocated to different carriages, and each one had a black man looking after it, and from that point on we would sleep on board, be fed on board. And we pulled out of San Francisco late in the afternoon, travelling through San Francisco and over the Rockies, and eventually to Salt Lake City, then to Chicago, marching for a time in some of those places for exercise until we got to Chicago, where we changed trains and then went down to Cleveland, where we then went aboard buses to travel to a huge American Army base called Camp Miles Standish. The number of men there training, you couldn't believe it. And you knew what they were training for, the invasion of Europe. And we, in a way, would be part of that. And while we were there, we were entertained in American homes. That's the emotion of remembering a lot of those people who took us into their homes, showed us around, And apart from occasionally having to do KP duty, that's military police with the manhood in the American Army, because they took us along to be part of it in case any of our men were in trouble. But when we got to one night to the outside of I think it was a cinema at the time, and a fun area outside, and there was a brawl going on, the big man, a Negro, looked at me and says, "You stay on this car." And they took them on, quietened it all, put them in vehicles they had ordered, and they were carted away for a time in jail. But that's the only time I struck any trouble. We found it a delight in different homes. We were given leave to go up to New York, and accommodation was arranged, and we were shown over the place. Another time they sent half a dozen of us on a special trip up to New York, where we were met by suitable staff, American Air Force, Army, and civilians who took us along to attend a ceremony up on the Rockefeller building. I forget, it would have been at least a dozen floors up, and on that they were going to unveil a memorial structure with the names of Australia and America, who were partners in the Pacific War, and the person who did that was Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the American president. Two women then showed us around places we hadn't seen on our visits. On one place was a war campaign to raise funds on a big, I don't know what you call it, was held in Times Square. There were thousands of people, and the entertainment went on most of the night. And that was a war effort thing. We went back to Camp Miles Standish, and one day I and a couple of my mates had a day free, and we went up to Boston, and I wanted to look in a jeweller's shop because I wanted to buy something for my mum. And while I was in there, and I was actually buying a golden rosary beads, went two very fashionable women in their 50s, I would say, came over to ask us, seeing our uniform and the badge Australia on our shoulder, and wanted to talk. And one of their remarks was, "Oh, when they saw the rosy beads, you have churches down there." And I said, "A lot of your men will be enjoying some of those places in our country when they get down there. And we're going on to Europe," which we did. And we had nearly a month to wait there. That's why we had all these trips, to get a ship across the Atlantic. Because we learned afterwards they couldn't put us on a convoy because they travel at the slowest ship's speed, and you're in danger the whole time. We went down to New York then, eventually, to board the ship, and it was the Queen Mary. The Queen Mary was a troop ship, fitted out in Australia. I only learned after the war they were in Sydney for something like 5 weeks being fitted out as a troop ship. and then they were loaned to the Americans to use by them on continuous trips across the Atlantic. Every time they went across the Atlantic, they carried a division of American troops and extras like our group. They also carried all they could in enough for that group of armies to have all what they needed in England, because they didn't overload America, who was fighting to feed its people. And on board with us, there were 22,000. There were 5,000 crew because of servicing all those men. And the meal, breakfast started at 5 in the morning, no lunch, and dinner finished at 8 at night, and you did it in shifts. You were given a bunk, which originally would have had 2 people. The bunks were increased to 4, and you couldn't sleep with your knees up. But you had 2 hours in there, 4 hours out in the passage, while somebody else took over. You got 1 visit up to the deck a day, and that lasted half an hour, during which time you would visit their PX, where they sold anything and everything. And you got to look at the one ship that was running. It was actually a cruiser, and it was travelling at 32 knots, and a submarine couldn't touch you. And 5 days across the Atlantic into Glasgow. And we lived well. It was a bit boring, but now you know you're in the war. And when we arrived at Glasgow, we went straight off the ship, and there was a train standing there, an English train of course, and with our gear we went straight on board that, and all that night we travelled until we arrived at Brighton on the south coast, seaside town, and we were being put up in a seaside tourist hotel of 6 floors, and it was in Air Force hands, and an Australian Air Force group were running the whole show. And when it became daylight, it was great looking at England go by and noticing that under a tree here there's a tank, and under that tree there's an aeroplane. They've got everything there for the invasion to come. And they only had to stop somewhere for some sort of meal once because we travelled overnight. And when we got to Brighton, it was a matter of RAAF control there, and we were given a couple of days off, and a few of the blokes, myself, went up to London. Well, most of them did. Together we went up with them, and we visited Australia House, and traditionally they sit you down and give you a cup of coffee or tea and a scone. And there were magazines there to read, among them Flight magazine, and thumbing through that there was a casualty list, and reading down Dudley Hickey, my elder brother, and he, at that time I didn't know what had happened, but learned later that he'd been shot down flying a boat fighter off the coast of Sicily when the Allies kicked Germans out of Africa, and they were landing there prior to fighting their way up Italy. I still get emotional. Because I kept remembering that from the time I left Australia, I wrote a letter. It may not be completed on one day, it may be here several days, but I would write a letter every chance I could get, and I would number it, and that was partly because you couldn't write a lot on it because it was all being vetted, but it was to get them used to receiving a letter, because you can imagine the case when Dudley was missing, at that stage missing, believed killed. The Air Force contacted them by phone and by telegram, and so I hoped getting a letter every day they wouldn't be afraid. Anyway, that was a bit of a blow. I imagined how my folks felt, and my twin sister. Anyway, after 2 days in London, and we were put up in the upstairs room of a bank. At Australia House, they gave you a card with an address, and anywhere they'd put you up for the night. And we didn't even get to meet the people. But back to Brighton, when the squadron leader there said to me, there's a car arriving for you tomorrow morning, and you will go down to Lavington, that's on the other side of England. And I said, why? Who else is going? Oh, just you. And anyway, the driver took me down, and I visited Lavington while I was there this time, and there's only buildings there and the airfield's gone. And when I got there, I found there was nobody under training. There was a group of officers who were part of the EAT scheme. You know what the EAT scheme is? Empire Air Training Scheme. I'll tell you more about that after. After going up to London, where I became aware of my brother's death in the flying bow fighters, returned to Brighton, where I was told that in the morning a car will take you over to Lavington, and that is over near Bristol. Not that I knew that at the time, but I said, why am I going over there? Because there's 200 other people who came with me, and I'm told I'm going. Anyway, I driven over to Lavington, where it was the headquarters of the EAT scheme, the Empire Training Scheme. The whole caboodle was run from there. My role was going to be a sampling of the group that I was with and arrived with in England. In other words, in every group that came over, Lavington had somebody they would check to see if everything was being taught correctly. I didn't know that at the time, but when I got up there, I only saw officer rank people, and the next day they took me out, and there's the aircraft, the Airspeed Oxford, 2-engined aircraft, pretty nifty. And they said, right, hop in and we'll fly. And I said, in the co-pilot's seat? He said, no, in the pilot's seat. I'm just going along. And that's all I knew about the aircraft. I'd never seen one before. And I said, well, you've got to tell me how much power I need on takeoff. And what's the flap speed? So he did, and he just said, fly. And I went up and did a lot of manoeuvres and steep turns and the whole lot. And just went over 3 days. I did instrument letdowns, the dictar system. If you're on the left it was a dot, and if you're on the right it was a dar. And hadn't done any of that in Australia. And they had a system of night flying in daytime. They would have flares sodium flares along the runway, and they'd put a screen up in the cockpit where only sodium light could come through, and they had a sodium light shining on the instrument. So as far as you'd sitting in the cockpit, it was night outside. And so I did a day flying around and landing and flying instruments, and I did similar the next day, and various things I had not reached in my training stage in Australia. Anyway, they said you can go back to Brighton. No comments, nothing. So I got a car back to Brighton, and when I arrived there, the squadron leader in charge of everybody in the hotel, I said, what was all that about? Oh, he said, you did very well. I said, yes, but what? And he said, well, they sample every group that comes over, and you got picked out to do it. And so that was, I'll tell you the line I can follow through my training. Anyway, after that, we had to hang around Brighton for about 2 weeks before the course at South Cerney, which is the main base for a group of satellite fields, where they were using that type of aircraft to train right up to the stage where you were competent on the aircraft and on the conditions that applied in England. I think we were there 3 months, and one exercise we did there was they took us out in the back of a big truck that canvas and you couldn't see out, and we were dropped at different places and we had to find our way back to South Cerney. Now, we were strangers in England, we were in uniform, and there was a good risk. A lot of people will think we were Germans, having been shot down. We have to prove that we were adept enough to beat the circumstances. And they all got back. One man stole an aeroplane from another base and flew it back. But fortunately, he had flown one of those before. And anyway, we all got back. I got thumbed a ride with a big truck. The bulky man driving the truck definitely was suspicious of me because he didn't talk. I just said, I'm going to South Cerney. Right. Anyway, he dropped me there, and I got in through the far side of the airfield, climbed through a barbed wire fence and reported. And that was that one exercise. An interesting thing there, it was a peacetime base. All the buildings were 2-storey. They were in interior heated, concrete footpaths, bitumen roads, good mess room, and they were a top training centre for the EAT scheme. And well, we did a lot of flying on different exercises, landing at different satellite fields. We were there for 3 months, and when we passed out of there, we were ready to go on to Wellington's, where we would get our crew. Now, while we were there on parade one morning, a mosquito came across. Now this is an overall grass field, and the mosquito appeared over there. He was showing off because everybody was on parade, and on the far side of the field was an igloo hangar, but it was open one on both sides, and he thought he could get through that because he went through, his wings cut that igloo on both sides, which promptly fell down, and he crashed on the other side because he had taken a wing off. But he didn't answer a court-martial because he was also killed. But that's another, like those other crashes we witness. We are now in a flying world and that sort of thing happens. I don't know of any record of that, but there would be. And so that was almost the first day on parade there. And in that first week, we were made to attend 5 funeral services for crews killed in the previous week. And that was pilots, because we only one man or a training instructor or you. On the airspeed oxygen, to get into the cockpit, you had to climb up on the wing, walk up the wing and climb into the cockpit. To prevent you slipping on the wing, they had an abrasive material glued up on the wing, and that was enough, if it lifted, to cause a stall, and that was probably what killed 5 men in our first week. So now we were veterans of what not to do, and nothing like that happened with our course. We did a lot of night flying, a lot of cross countries, reading from maps because everything was strange to us, and at the end of that time we were really ending our training time in the EAT scheme. Our next posting was up to Church Broughton near Litchfield, which was an Australian base, and training onto Wellingtons. Now the Wellingtons was chosen at that stage because we were getting a crew for the first time. And that system, you would imagine they would have picked out who would fly with who. But we all met, we pilots had arrived there knowing each other into this big hangar. And in there were radio operators, navigators, gunners, all there, having completed their course in a different stream of places. And the boss up on the stage said to the pilots, pick your crew. And if you thought that getting a crew with an experience that they would know who should go with that, they said pick your crew. So you walked around amongst all these people and said, would you like to fly with me? And I got my crew there, the navigator, radio operator, 2 gunners, and at that stage you didn't get a flight engineer because you didn't need one. But the main point in the training on the Wellington was the fact they had a nose and a tail turret, and you're going to do a lot of gunnery work plus practice bombing on the practice range, but also in operating as a crew. And to go at night, if you wanted to go anywhere, you needed a navigator because England was blacked out, no lights. You could easily get lost if you didn't navigate. In fact, the last flight I did at Church Broughton was the final one in that training at that station. And the flight that I was down for that night was after dark. Fly down west of London, over the Channel into France and almost to the Mediterranean, where we dropped pamphlets. This is still not an operational flight. On the way back, and not a real dark night, there was a little bit of glow coming from clouds above, from a moon above that, and out of the night in front of me came very rapidly, in a matter of seconds, a Focke-Wulf 190. That's the one with the radial engine on. And I pushed the controls there and he pulled his nose up and he went over with inches to spare. And the mid-upper, the tail gunner said, "Shit, did you see that?" He should have known I'd seen it, because a violent manoeuvre would have worried them all. But, you know, there's only seconds in that. Obviously, it frightened him as it frightened me, because I said to the crew, keep an eye out, because he's bound to come back. But he didn't. And we made it back to base, found the bombing range by good navigation, went back to base, and that was the last flight at Church Broughton before I went on to Halifax's. One of the, or several things whilst we were there before that final flight, there was snow on the ground every day, and in the morning to get your aircraft you had to go out to the dispersal, clear the snow away off the wings and get your aircraft ready, and the whole base would go out and clean the ice off the runway, because the ice would be ragged and would do tyre damage. So much so that when we were doing night circuits, they had a man with a Aldous light, a bright light. You'd stop before he went onto the runway, and he would examine the tyres. And on one night, he's bending over the tyre when the tyre blew. And suddenly he didn't have overalls on, he had all his underwear. And he staggered away from that, and of course that flight was my flight. Had to taxi out of the way on a flat tyre, and it was until they changed it I got the exercise done. But that was amusing to us. It was shocking to him, but it showed what ice could do to tyres on the runway if it wasn't all cleared off. And Church Broughton was an Australian base. It was built on the flying side of it, the airfield and all the hangars, and the offices were on that side of a highway, and the mess hall and the bathrooms and all that were on the other side, and you could be anything from trucks to a double-decker bus going through on that road. Our accommodation was on the same side as the mess, but up the road you had to walk nearly a quarter of a mile, and the accommodation was fibro igloos hangars, and they were scattered among trees. If you wanted a shower, you had to walk down that road into the shower, and all the showers were in the ceiling. You only had to turn a tap on, and everybody was in there having a shower at the same time. From there you dressed and you went to the mess. But on that side was where you went to catch the bus, going through if you wanted to go into Litchfield. And we all bought a bike on our first trip into a pedal bike, because nobody went anywhere anymore, and they were quite happy to sell their bikes. And with the bikes we would cycle around when we had the hours off, down through the countryside to the farms, buy eggs, and whatever was offering, and we had a heater in the middle of those igloos to heat the building, and we go home and cook extra food with those bikes. We took them when we went as far as Driffield, and then when we went home we just left them there for anybody who wanted them. But the time at Church Broughton was a busy one, a lot of night flying, and you could say that any time you were in the air in England, there would be probably as many as 500 other aircraft in the air. Mm-hmm. Some of them would be Germans, and Germans not only bombed Coventry by, what were they, Heinkel, once, and they flattened Coventry, but they also used their dive bombers to dive on villages. And that must have been a horrifying happening, and bombs. And not only were we trying, fighter pilots were training, bow fighter pilots were training, people flying the Atlantic were training, and at any night there's these hundreds of aircraft. And you hope that the warning system in the back of each aircraft, the, what do they call it? IFF, information.
Identification, friend or foe.
Yeah. And, but over England, everybody had those systems on, but that was mostly for the information people on the ground, that they wouldn't shoot you down.
Okay.
And I went over to England last month, Howard. Had a month there with my youngest son. I couldn't have got there without him, and I couldn't have got around without him. Yeah. Fortunately, a friend of his and Tiana supplied us with a house if we wanted to, anywhere around Bristol, and also supplied us with a car which had a ground positioning thing in it, where we could find our way anywhere. And that was a wonderful advantage. We did a lot of driving. I was on the go every day. I was up at by 9 in the morning and ready to go.
Yeah, oh, that's good.
And didn't get back till after dark. Mostly we stopped at those areas along the various routes where they could feed 100 motorists at any time.
Yes, yeah.
And it was great.
No, that's good.
But before I left Church Broughton, I was reading in a local paper people advertising their cars for sale. The thing said, on blocks, hasn't driven since the war started, and a price of £25. So I went with some of my crew to this address, and we bought the car. And at that stage, I didn't have a driving licence. I hadn't driven a car. And I said, how do I get a driving licence, to the man who sold me the car? He said, you just go to the post office. And for 2 and 6pence, they give you a driving licence.
No test or anything?
No.
Gosh.
They were glad, you know, England, all of England was at war.
Yeah.
Everybody's life had been changed. They were using food vouchers to get their share of the food, and everybody was doing something. And so we managed to leave Church Broughton, Church Broughton, driving our car with 2 bikes on the top, and we went along to Marston Moor. Now Marston Moor was just the western side of, what was the town? York, a big town, a city, got the wall around the original part of York, and got one of the biggest cathedrals I've ever seen, and after we finished our training, we went back through York, visited the cathedral. It was a Catholic one, and I'm a Catholic, and that was a real experience, a beautiful place. Also went to Coventry and visited the rebuilt cathedral, which had been flattened in the first weeks of the war. And what a beautiful place that is. And an interesting feature, are you copying?
Yep.
Good. An interesting feature about cathedrals is unless a town or a city had a cathedral, they could not call themselves a city. You had to have a cathedral. So altogether I visited 4 cathedrals. I wanted to visit them. I go to church, and it was an experience. I visited Anglican ones and a few other breeds, and they were all different, some of them quite ancient. And it was a delight talking to some of the people, elderly people, who were standing guard in all these old places, there to inform you what it was. And then they found out I was interested. I was still a churchgoer. It was half an hour of non-stop education, and it was great. Anyway, we left Church Broughton driving ourselves, and the first place was Marston Moor. Do you remember any history of Marston Moor? You don't?
I don't
The
know.
Battle of Marston Moor.
That was where one of the ancient battles between the Scots and the English was fought.
Okay. Yep.
Not far from York. And of course it was mostly an open field now with some buildings, and the buildings we were staying in for the few days we were there were people's houses which were no longer occupied. And it was our first flight on Halifax's, and that was interesting. They only gave us a couple of trips due after you did a couple of circuits with a competent man. You flew around for a couple of hours and enjoyed yourself. And a week later we moved to the main base, which was on the other side of York. Right now I can't think of its name.
Fowsham?
And then
Fowsham? Fulsham? Fowsham, was it? Is that where you were based?
yeah, no, that is one, but that wasn't the one we went to.
Okay.
Anyway, we were now very close to Driffield, where we would be flying, doing our operations. When I got there, it was on, they had previously been a Mark 1, now that we're on to a Mark 5, but they were still Rolls-Royce. But now we had an engineer, a flight engineer. So they took off with the full crew on board now, one circuit, and the instructor hopped out and said you can do 3 or 4 circuits and then come home. I got halfway around the first circuit and the tower said the airfield's now closed. You've got to go to another field. And I said, well, where's the nearest field? He said, Driffield. I said, well, give me a heading for Driffield. Well, my navigator looks up where that is on the map. So he gave me a heading. I said to the navigator, I'm going to climb to 5,000 feet because I don't know how much high ground there is between now and then. So we arrived at Driffield not knowing that's where we were going to be based during our operations. We had to stay there the night, and that was pleasant because that night in the big hall they had a team of entertainers, a lot of them middle-aged women, music and singing and cups of tea and whatever, and before we were shown to our room. And next morning we started up with our aircraft and flew back to Marston Moor, or the other place. Did a couple more circuits there, and then we were posted to Driffield, where we were taken over by a bus, except that I drove behind the bus with my car. And we got onto the base. We got our accommodation. I was an officer, so we were in one line of buildings. The crew were in another line. I would eat in a big brick place where they had a piano and staff waiting on you, whilst my crew were down in a lesser place looking after themselves. While I was there, I had to do, I forget what they call it, a duty visit to the other RAAF messes to see they were being treated right. I sat down, had a meal with the mechanics and whoever else at that place who were lesser rank, and that was an experience for me. And when we got to Driffield, of course, it had runways, it had a big hangar, it had a lot of staff, and it was Australian personnel, except a lot of the ground staff were English people, or anywhere from Britain. And during the operations they worked horrible hours. We would sometimes aircraft going out every night, not the same crews, but the same aircraft, and they were getting them ready, bombing them up, getting the fuel on. And in nasty weather, quite often snow on the ground, and drizzle falling. And but I was amazed to see the aircraft I was sent out with. One of the previous skippers who was there on his tour, that the aircraft I was climbing into was a Halifax, but it had radial engines. And what I learned about them in one circuit was all I learned about them. And I did the one circuit. He said, now you can do 2 circuits. And I went up with my engineer, and we done 2 circuits. Now I was ready to be operational. So now I'm settled on Driffield. That's a little town west of Hull, and up the coast is the town of Scarborough, a seaside place. I, as an officer, and my mid-upper gunner, who had a commission, lived in a hut for rank, and we attended a brick building, interior heated, where the officer groups, that's the people who are running the base, and the officers who were flying lived in that. Because of the numbers, I was in a hut shared with the rooms, with a passageway down the middle and cubicles we all had for each officer. And Joe Herman, you'll hear about later, was my friend. He was sleeping in one of those, and we talked a lot. Because I was an officer and had a role of keeping in touch with the dispersed aircraft, I was supplied with a bike. What's the big British bike?
Triumph.
Oh, anyway.
Yeah.
Their top bike, and that was outside my door every morning if I wanted to use it. Anyway, that's a bit of snobbery. Having arrived at the base, we were now, and I had done one circuit in a strange at Halifax, which now had radial engines, and a couple of solo circuits with a flight engineer, because you can't fly a Halifax without an engineer, because a lot of things are back here. And we were ready for our first flight. Our first flight in Driffield with daylight flights down to squadron size, and the whole squadron, which at that time was 466, Halifax Australian Squadron, was going down and bombing buzz bomb sites. Fortunately, there were no fighters operating. They were very busy with the landings in Normandy, and but they did have a lot of very accurate ACAC guns, 88 mil. They could pick you off at 17,000 feet. On the first flight to do a bomb sight on the buzz site, beautiful day. We were going there individually as a group, you know, not in formation. And as we approached the site to bomb, the guns opened up. And when you looked over the side, though we were up at this stage at 14,000 feet, you could see the bullets coming up. I was looking down and they appear to wander up because any slight movement in the aircraft or in the air appears to be the thing doing a movement, but it's a visual thing. And that's the first time I saw an aircraft shot down. On the same road there were some Lancasters, and it was a Lancaster, and he was hit. I don't know how, or I didn't see, but I was aware that this aircraft was dropping a wing and losing height. And it did this on the way down. Fell down sideways, recovered and pulled the nose up, stalled and fell away again, and did that all the way down onto the ground as I watched it. The interesting thing was, and the horrible thing, no parachutes opened.
None at all.
So the blast on that aircraft must have killed them all, or damaged the aircraft for enough to stop them getting out. But that was our introduction to war. We did one the next day, the same sort of target. This time, the squadron leader, leading our squadron, 466, said, we'll try something new this morning. We are the only squadron going to bomb this particular buzz bomb site. I suggest I go first and you all follow me. Which we did, and this time we're up at 14,000 feet, and we were crossing the channel, because those sites are in Holland, no, Belgium, on the southern side. He said, I want you close behind and we'll be very damaging on the ground. The first thing we know, the guns opened up, and they were very accurate, because I don't know what happened to the squadron leader, but he certainly caused the shamble behind him, because the first thing I know that his aircraft is getting very close to me, and now a Halifax, you don't have any throttle movement. You have fixed positions. Now, I'm looking into the eyes of the rear gunner, who's like this, when I managed to slow down enough not to hit him. Well, now I said to the rear gunner, you okay back there? because after that the aircraft were everywhere, and that's the last time we did that particular method of bombing. Anyway, that was a daylight one, very informative to a new crew, and my crew were well trained. I take some credit for that, because there was no conversation unless you had something vital to tell me. And you don't jump until I say bail out. If I'm killed, you do what you can. And there's no time for conversation. Anyway, I have heard from other crews who were telling jokes. I don't believe it, but that's what they said in the books they wrote. But anyway, the next one was another flight to France, and this time it was going to be a night flight. I'll take you back to that last flight. Before we left Driffield, before we got in our aircraft, we had been briefed for the target, and at the last moment, now we're all at the aircraft, scattered around the dispersals, and two aircraft, which I happened to be first, and the other one was not far away, and we're all standing around between the two aircraft talking, because we've been told there's a 30-minute delay. Now, while I was standing there, a Catholic priest arrived among us, and he said to the crews, "I will give communion to anybody who wishes to take it." In other words, he wasn't asking if you were Catholic. He would give it to everybody, and only one man refused it. And I don't know who that was. Anyway, by the time he got to me, after that crew and through my crew, I was the last one. He gave me communion, and he said, "What's your name?" Which he had done to everybody. And I said, "I'm Ron Hickey." "Ah," he said, "you're the carpenter." Now, I'm halfway around the world. I'm not expecting anybody to know me. Obviously, our record, our file, had gone to America, to England with us. May not be how we travel, but by a landline or whatever. And he said, "Right." I said, "No, I'm not a carpenter, I'm a handyman." He said, "Right, I've got an empty hut over there, I've got tools, I've got timber, and how would you like to come and build an altar for me?" And I did over the next few days before I went off that flight. And the funny thing is, I never ever attended a mass there, because every time it was on, I was away doing things, dropping bombs. I meant to have a look at that hut when I was over there last month, and I've forgotten. But anyway, that was interesting. Already you got a reputation. And I built an altar and an ambo, or that's where you read the gospel, and I enjoyed doing it, and I was happy that as a Catholic I had built an altar. Now after that it was all business, and the first one was a flight down to France, night time. There were 400 aircraft going, and we were going to some target that would be marked, which would be destroying a bridge and a tunnel in the railway system, cutting off the railway supplies going down to Normandy. About the targets in France without looking at my logbook, but I did go back to bomb places in France, railways, railway bridges, road bridges, not me in particular, but enough aircraft to do the damage, and one of the most devastating targets was the tunnel that came off a ridge and went on through and eventually up to Germany, and so blocking that stopped a lot of them getting down to Normandy also. Early in the war, before I got there, but in 1939, the first bombing forces were aircraft like Hamdens and, well, quite out of date, but they went out as squadrons to Germany, and quite often none of them came back. But the little item that's interesting is that they knew when they were crossed into Germany, because the people on the ground stopped waving to them.
Oh, I see.
But many of those didn't come back. And of course, the Wellingtons were coming along. Actually, the first 4-engine bombers had been built, and they were getting to the stage of flight testing and all that. But the Wellingtons bore the brunt of the war for that time. Now, I did 35 operational flights over enemy territory. There's half of that, a dozen of those were bombing in France and in Holland, because on the day that the British forces landed in Holland from gliders, they landed up close to the Denmark end of Holland, and their target was to capture the bridge at on the Rhine near the town of Arnhem. The day that they crossed the channel to bomb, I and several hundred bomber aircraft, Lancasters and Halifaxes, had bombed Cologne in the morning. And the reason Cologne was bombed because they were stopping the retreating Germans under attack in France, coming down to join the battle to prevent them crossing the Rhine. At the same time, we, on that morning, we had actually, that Cologne bombing was the day before. On the morning they landed in France, we had bombed every airfield in Holland and Belgium. It had fighters on them, because as we went home, we could see dozens of Dakotas with gliders on them. They were loaded with troops in the aircraft and in the gliders, and they dropped them up on the northern end of Holland to take that bridge. Now they got to the bridge, and the reason they didn't have any fighters attacking them is we destroyed all the airfields that morning, and they took the one end of the bridge, but the tragedy was not the fault of the man who couldn't cross, because the Germans had moved a tank division in the little town of Arnhem on the other side of the bridge in what was Germany, and our forces had to retreat into the town on the Allied side, where they managed to hold out for a time until they were taken prisoner. And the reason they couldn't get their forces up there was for some peculiar reason, a horrible mistake. All the radio in the landing forces had the wrong frequency for the British headquarters in England, and they couldn't talk to them. And that caused the loss of that whole thing. And that was a disaster. They'd landed, hundreds of them, at great risk in gliders, took part of the bridge, and nobody could tell England there's a panzer division holding the bridge, or we would have bombed it. Because something like a fortnight before we had bombed in Arnhem, and they dropped bombs, all of them had a time on them. They would blow up for 2 weeks afterwards, here, there, everywhere. So some of them caught the panzer divisions. But that's talking about war now. And I did get to bomb Arnhem on that occasion.
Can you tell me the difference in your opinion of the Halifax and the Lancaster? What are the main differences in the aircraft from your point of view?
Well, I could only tell you the difference because I went to England last month when I got to climb into one. Now, to us in the air, there was very little difference, except that I saw one very close one night. But the aircraft, the Lancasters weren't as fast, and they had Merlins and we had Bristols.
Yeah.
But my awareness of over the enemy territory or going out, I didn't have one. I saw both of them shot down, Lancasters and Halifaxes. We mostly went out at night. You took off from your base just on dark. The only thing that protected you, you all took off at laid down times on the briefing, and that kept you apart for the first part. But crossing the channel, you occasionally would see a bright flash of flame and burning things falling down, and that would have been a collision of either two Halifaxes or Lancaster. Mm-hmm. But what I learned from my visit to Germany last month, that you would get out of a Halifax easier than you could get out of a Halifax.
Out of Lancaster.
I mean,
Lancaster.
you could get out of the Halifax easier than a Lancaster. Because the Lancaster was much narrower in the fuselage. You couldn't stand up without bumping your head. You had to climb over things to get into the tail gunner. In fact, I went into the tail turret when I was over there, and I could only crawl into it, but I was an old man, and I couldn't turn around enough to get out of it. The only way I could get out of it was backwards, the way I came in, until David could grab my feet and pull me out. But going up to the, through the fuselage, you had to keep your head down. When you went over the main spars, two of them that went out to the wings, you had to climb over there, and those. When you got up to the blister, whatever material it was made out of, it was all transparent. The whole crew was there except the gunners, the bomb aimer, the navigator, and the radio operator, and the pilot. The bomb aimer went down, crawled up to the forward bombing position. But every one of those men had to climb over something. Mm-hmm. I climbed over a restriction to, like the captain sat there and his controls were there and the instruments spread across there, and the bomb aim would go down through there. How I got there, I don't know, because I had the battle to get down there. Yep. But everybody, I had to climb over things to get into the pilot's seat. Mm-hmm. Now in Halifax, the two spars between them had a cushioned seat for the crew who could sit there if they wanted to on takeoff, because it would be the strongest place on the aircraft. But if you were injured, you could take the man back there to lay him down, and there was medical kit there. But you couldn't do that in Lancaster. Now, Lancaster got all the publicity, but I wonder now how many crew got out of a aircraft successfully. You could bail out of the Halifax. I could go out from a roof in the over my seat, if that was the one that was the best to go out. The crew who was on the floor below the pilot, because it was too depth, to go down to their position, they would go down steps beside the pilot. If there was a second dickie on board, like it was customary for a co-pilot or the captain to go for one flight sitting beside the pilot on an operational flight. It didn't count as a trip over Germany, but they would fold that seat back most of the time and then crawl down in Lancaster. But in the Halifax, the radio operator was under the pilot, the navigator was under the pilot, and the bomb aimer was down below, usually lying on his belly when he bombed. And they could get out through a hatch in the floor, which was a normal position for them. And the captain and the engineer could go down there too, or could go out to the roof. It wasn't wise to go out the roof because you could hit the wing or a prop on the way. But if you crash landed and you're lying, sitting in the act, that's where you went. And it was an education to me that it would be hard to get out of everywhere except the rear turret and the mid-upper gunner.
Yeah.
But if you went out the top turret, there was a danger you would hit the tailplane or the elevator, the rudder controls.
Did you have a question, Howard? Do you think of?
Well, seeing all these aircraft being hit and going down in flames, and those aircraft, your friends that didn't come back, how did you handle psychologically, you and your friends, the fact that you were probably living the last part of your life?
Well,
Going to
well,
die, in other words.
crew-wise, when I got back from the first flight where they saw 2 aircraft shot down, I said to them when we met after the debriefing, now how did you feel today when you saw those aircraft shot down? And you knew that we were also a target because the shells were bursting all around. Now, all of my crew in some way were religious, right? Different religions, but my tail gunner professed to be an atheist. Now I went through a lot of them in turn. I said to the bomb aimer, how do you feel? He said, I was scared stiff. Those shells were coming very close. I said, how are you, to the navigator, because he sits back a little further. He said I was worried and nervous. And the radio operator said the same thing. And then I said to the flight engineer, who had a station just behind me and would normally a lot of the time be standing up, he said, I wasn't scared, but I was a bit worried because even though I was there, I could see the shells ahead. But I had a lot of things to keep an eye on. Now the rear gunner could swing his turret around and fall out. The mid-upper gunner generally had to drop out of his turret onto the floor in the aircraft and go to an escape hatch somewhere around there, or go down to the rear turret. If he wanted to get out quickly, he'd go out the top, but that was dangerous. But anyway, they all told me they were frightened. Now, I said to the atheist, and how did you feel? He said, well, I don't normally pray, but I said, I called to my mother. And he said, then I called to my girlfriend. And then he said, I said, oh God, help us. So there you are. Now I'm either thick in the head. I was concerned because I was still flying the aeroplane and I was still choosing to avoid the flak I could see. The crew would tell me if there was, like the gunners would that's the German gunners, would get the shell up to your height. And then the next one, because they were aiming at you, that one would explode with a big black cloud, and then the next one, and the tail gunner said, the third one has happened and it's on a line for us, I would then turn away. They were always briefed to tell me what was happening, anything that was threatening. And on most targets over Germany, there were many times when ground fire was a threat. You couldn't always see it until you got near the target. In the daytime, like when we bombed the RAAF, there were so many shells bursting, it looked like a stratiform cloud over it, black. They were shooting them up. But as you came into the sight of the target, fortunately for us, we were a little later in the stream because Driffield was in Yorkshire, the Lancasters are up south of us. But the cities were starting to burn and the markets were going down, and you could see the aircraft all around, the ones coming behind you, the ones ahead, and all around, and among them you could see the German fighters. Now the policy was, if the Germans were there, left you or in front, you didn't shoot at them. You didn't, in other words, let them know that you were there. And that was the policy. If one turned towards you, well, the gunners had to go. As you came up to the target, there were bombers up there, out there, round there, down there. And you wanted to know from your mid-upper gunner, was there any overhead when they opened their bomb doors? Because then you would have a string of bombs take you out. So I'm in a turn away at that stage. Now looking at the bombing force ahead as we came up to target, and by now we've seen aircraft shot down by night fighters. They all reported to me, some of them I'd see myself, and there's nothing you could do for it unless the fighter was on your tail. And now on coming up to the target, the whole sky's lit up by the fires, reflecting off the cloud and the burning city below. And I've seen a Lancaster just ahead of me, who got hit by flak, and the wing came off immediately, and the aircraft was tossing around. I didn't see anybody bail out. At the same time, lit up that night, I saw a body go past my nose with arms and legs flailing in the air, but I don't know whether he didn't have a parachute. I presume he used his brains and didn't open his parachute until he got below me and other aircraft. That was the wise thing to do. Quite often you saw our aircraft shot down by night fighters, the night fighters taking a risk over the target. Their flak tried not to hit them, but German flak was very accurate. And you know, you could go home remembering a half a dozen shot down, and they were Halifaxes and Lancasters. And some nights over the target they could lose up to 30 aircraft. In the Berlin raids, which I didn't get there for, they had 90 aeroplanes shot down. And so it was deadly over Germany. I did 2 trips to Williamstown, which was a port on the entrance to the Baltic Sea. And they had very many naval building facilities there, building submarines and boats. And Williamstown was, of course, on the German side of that channel through a number of little islands into the Baltic Sea. Coming out of for a submarine or battleships going, they would have to come out and go down the backside of Holland to start with, and behind part of Denmark, and have Denmark on the other side before they got into the North Sea. On those 2 raids, we went over at night, and that was crossing the North Sea and the north side of Holland, and the guns were all open up, and then you go down over Williamstown, and many flak guns would open up, and there below you was the city of Williamstown, and if you're lucky enough to be back a bit, they were all starting to burn, so you didn't have any difficulty bombing the city, but you're also bombing the port. There were dozens of submarines being built there, and battleships, and the whole lot. After the war, a few years later, I met a German lady who was now an Australian, and she made it a business to come and talk to me because it was well known I was a wartime pilot. And she said, I've got a bone to pick with you because you bombed my city before I got out of it. But I said, you're alive. She said I was lucky because most of the town got out, but those who were too far to get across the city, many of them died. But she said, I don't hold it against you. Anyway, she goes to my church.
Oh, right.
And I don't know whether you know the figures, that Germany had 900 submarines sunk. So they had to be at least 1,000 of them. And of course, we lost 56,000 aircrew over Holland, Denmark, Belgium, Germany and France. 56,000. And there were 5,000 who jumped and survived and ended up in a prison camp. So in the long run, there are 800 aircraft in Bomber Command shot down. The only service that suffered more or as many was the Navy and the Merchant Navy. They lost the same number, 50,000 Navy and Merchant Navy crossing the Atlantic. So the war was pretty unforgiving, but the Germans started the bombing before we did. and Coventry was flattened before we started. And of course the Navy and the British Air Force and the RAAF were flying on bombing raids against the submarines. And 10 Squadron, which was an Australian squadron, and they had gone to wing England just before the war started to pick up a couple of Sunderland flying boats. And they were up on the northern part of England, and they would have gone into the sea to take off somewhere around Blackpool. And they did a lot of operations for Europe from there out of the Atlantic. Now they went over just before the war started, and when the war started, Australia said to them, stay there, which they did. They were needed, and none of them got shot down, but they did see a couple of the German Condor aircraft. They were long-range aircraft, and they also joined the battle against the shipping. Quick conversion out of Dakota, landed, loaded up one morning, that's the whole squadron, 15 aircraft with our ground staff, the aircraft loaded with our equipment, and we took off after dawn because we hadn't trained on at night. We went over to a stop in the Middle East, his name I forget, and then overnight up to a field where Dubai is, where we overnight, a trip up after a fuel stop just before we left the where we were in the Gulf, across to Morapur, called, I forget now, a big town in India, where we overnighted, refueled, and went down to the field in the middle of area of India where we would be based. And that flight down from the north of India to the flight was a 7-hour flight. So that tells you how big India is. We did some night training at India so that we flew up to Dum Dum, which is the port in Calcutta, refueled, and flew on to Bangladesh, where we would be based for the next 2 weeks. Flew 7 sorties down to Rangoon, came back to Calcutta and back to base. Was told we were catching a train, we would be flown down. The train was cattle wagons that had been roofed and had seats in. Enough carriages for the crew to fill all those wagons, and they had a wagon up front which is the kitchen. We went aboard the train, and we were in the train 5 days, and it's very hot in India. In my case, being an officer, I had a little bunk, a seat that went across the carriage, and that's how they were. You could sleep on that, and you had a door that opened out onto the ground. You walked out of there up to the front to the engine, where you could have a shower under the refueling water tank, or you could eat your breakfast standing beside thing, and we eventually got to Calcutta again. We went aboard a boat, what would have been a coastal freighter, primitive, out of date. We went aboard in Calcutta and spent 10 days getting to Perth. We slept in hammocks. We were short of food because the fridge didn't work. All the potatoes went bad. To keep it cool where you were downstairs, they would put scoops out through the portholes facing the slipstream of the wind which blow in. One poor bloke woke up one night when the big wave came aboard and his bunk hammock was filled with water, and it shocked him. He was almost insane at the time. He thought the boat had gone down. Anyway, he got over that, but he wouldn't sleep near a porthole. Now the rest of us had to use bunks over the mess tables. You'd get out in the morning, have up your bunk, onto the table, down to the deck below, have a shower, race up the steps, come back, and the meal was ready for you on the table. I went down the steps in a hurry, passed out just before the urinal, and banged my head on the floor. I came to where some of the crew was being very kind to me. I went to the toilet, went back up, and the doctor came to see me. He said it was only all that exercise, jumping out of the bunk, off the table, down the steps, and another steps, got to the air, and that's just what it was. Anyway, we were right back in Perth in 10 days. We went ashore in Perth. Part of my crew, my radio operator, left the ship there. They lived in Perth, and a number of others. A lot of the food we needed, reprovisioning, arrived on the wharf on the trolley. On a very hot day, there were carcasses still frozen on the top. Outside was 100-degree day, and there it was in the sun when the wharfies' whistle blew and they walked off. Our squadron leader in command said, "Over the side, men, bring that food on board." The foreman came back quickly and said, "You touch that trolley and you won't get out of port." Now we were men, veterans coming home from war.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't know that ship. So, I still don't have any time for unions. We then left there, went straight to Sydney. The Sydney people, Adelaide people got off there and trained, went down by train to Adelaide. We got off to sit there and went by train to Brisbane. And I prayed through Sydney when I got home. And by taxi we were all taken down to Sandgate, where we joined the Air Force, to the same parade ground where we started our training. And there was my mum and my twin sister. and everybody meets their families. And we were told, here's your travel warrant, you can go home for 6 weeks. So I went to Stan Hinch's place. There was a pilot with me, stayed the night there with my mum and sister, and then travelled up to Monto and spent the time there. My dad was the station master there, and we went up by train there. It was a long journey and back home. And it was nice to see Mum and Dad and some of the family. And the next time I went in here, I was called back after the 6 weeks to be discharged from the Air Force. And that was at Amberley because Sandgate had closed down. And when I got to Amberley, I handed in all my gear, went through getting signatures like I did when I was getting on. And I got to the very last one when the squadron leader who handled that affair grabbed me and said, "Take it all back, you're staying in the Air Force for 2 years," because I volunteered. So I went and got it all back again. And in a week's time, I was on a ship, or I was on a flight to Townsville and another flight to New Guinea, where I joined a squadron based in Lae, and I spent 3 months flying all over New Guinea with 36 Squadron as a co-pilot for that time. And I'll tell you about that another day. Night, over the Roar, 10 aircraft were shut down out of 200. Joe Herman was shut down. He was on 466, the one squadron, Australian squadron I'd just left. He and I were now on different squadrons on the same target. He went down that night. When they hit his target, he said to the crew, hit his aircraft, it was falling to pieces. He said to the crew, bail out. The bomb aimer came upstairs, stand beside his seat, put the pack on him because the pilot wore a harness, but not the pack. He was putting that on Joe when the aircraft fell apart, before he got put on it, and he fell out of the aircraft with the bomb aimer, though he didn't know it. He bumped into something in the dark after he recovered by hitting his head and getting his memory bag. When he grabbed something at about 15,000 feet in the pitch dark, grabbed it, and a voice said, "Do you mind hanging on to the other leg? That one's broken." And that was his bomb aimer. They went down on the one parachute a long time after to the top of a tree in a huge snowdrift, and they both lived to do the tale. Joe Herman, my partner, friend, went to refugee prisoner camp, and I came home, and I met him back in Australia. Now I've already mentioned my first 2 trips, and this flight was going to be at night, and they're going to be about 400 aircraft on it, and we were going to at night be flying down England over the Channel but not quite to the where the landings were. At a suitable point we would turn left to bomb a target in France. The target would be marked by mosquito, and we would navigate our way until we saw that flare. Now they hadn't forecast dirty weather, but as we approached France over the channel, there was a mighty storm building up, and we apparently felt fairly up front in the group, and we entered the storm, and that was quite a frightening experience, I can tell you, because apart from the sort of turbulence that would come later, we were lit up, or the aircraft was lit up, by what is called St. Elmo's fire. The tall ships in the past, in their travels around the world, experienced it at different times. And in this case, the aircraft was lit up by this blue-green flame all over the aircraft, in the cockpit, on the windscreen, like a TV screen gone mad, and off the props you'd see the screen flame going back. Fortunately, I had read about the experiences in those ships. I knew what St. Elmo fire was. I said to the crews, "Don't be afraid, it's harmless. It won't damage the aircraft." And that didn't quite believe that, but we did go on, and I can tell you it was a sight. I've never experienced it since, and they haven't. But then, and we entered a real storm, lightning, turbulence, and the St. Elmo's fire was gone. The turbulence was severe. I said to the crew, "Be ready to bail out." I'm really at that stage of my career, somewhat of an amateur. I've not experienced this. But you know, only 2 aircraft went to the target, and that was my aircraft and another one. We arrived there as the markers went down, and we bombed. 380 aircraft went home as they entered the storm. They had to drop their bombs in the North Sea before landing back at all the different airfields up inland. I'm not mentioning that as something to say I'm a great man. That happened to us. We persisted with the turbulence, and you have to remember that on board there's 5 tons of bombs, your aircraft being thrown up and down and stressing the aircraft, and it was what they call an Atlantic storm, which comes across the Atlantic, beats up France or England, and it was quite frightening. We survived that. And obviously now I've become a competent pilot. I'll handle whatever comes along. If they shoot me down, well, I can't do anything about that. But anyway, we did have a couple of storms, other ones, but not vicious ones. I would experience them in my civil career. But that night, not only did we get to the target, but we hit the target. And we went back home the way the mosquito had come up clear of the storms. And anyway, we were now accomplished crew, if you like. We'd been through the worst of it, but later we would experience enemy fire. Now we got back to base that night. Actually, we got back before most of them because they had to go out to sea and drop their bombs. And 2 nights later, or no, 2 days later, we flew down to France again. The landings in Normandy had broken out from the beaches, and we were briefed to go down to Paris at, I think we were about 12,000 feet, and we were to bomb the marshalling yards on the northern side, eastern side of Paris. Now a marshalling yard consists of anything up to 12 railway sidings where all come together under a tower where the man there switches this each line according to what's on that carriage that's coming through, being pushed by a train. He sees that and he throws a switch, those points open and the traffic rolls in there. If it's another target, another one's open until the line of carriages he's pushing in all those dispersed railway sidings. On that day we were sent down to bomb that marshalling yard, not to bomb or harm Paris, but to be very accurate, we were told if we must not bomb before a certain time, and that is the order. No matter what, we could not bomb before that time. And when we passed over Paris, you could see the Eiffel Tower, the streets down below, and these 400 aircraft would have horrified Paris looking up at them. And when we got to the point of that time, we then started a huge circle out to the left. And at that stage I said to my crew, keep a look to the left, because the aircraft coming up behind are later than us, but they will join that circle. And we went out and cleared Paris on that side and then came back in for the bombing. On the way around, the German guns opened up and 2 aircraft were shot down. And that was our first real experience of the German anti-aircraft fire. Anyway, we came around, as we did all the other aircraft now, and we bombed that yard. I can tell you nothing would have come out of there afterwards. In there were 2 troop trains. I hate to think of the slaughter. They were going to Normandy. There was another train. When I say train, that's an engine and wagons. There was a train loaded with tanks. They were going to Normandy. Another one was loaded with ammunition. They were headed for it. And another one was loaded with fuel. And all those trains was in that yard when he bombed it. And from a book I read a couple of years after the war, they would claim that was the most destroyed target of the war. And I could understand that, a very compact, deadly cargo on the ground. And we stopped those going down to Normandy, because now they had broken off the beaches and they were facing German tanks and all the rest, and they would have needed all that. Because a few nights later, we did a flight down to bomb that area. And now we figured out, after we all got home, that the reason they wanted not to bomb me for a particular time, because they were in touch with the French underground. And they would have told all of those to get away from that marshalling yard. And we wouldn't have excuse the emotion. I don't think we killed any Frenchmen. And of course, there was a time, some weeks later, actually, or right up in August, where we went down there again. There were 400 aircraft at night, and on this occasion we were going to bomb the German line. Now Normandy was there, the front had now come there, Caen was there, and the line was being held by the Germans from that coast up to the northern coast of that finger of Normandy. And we went down that night, and I forget the name of the marker force, would mark the target, the German lines with red and amber lights. They would mark the British line with green and another colour. And we were not to bomb anything else than the red and amber lights. Actually, that night, the bombing was very accurate. I got to know an Englishman because he became an Australian and went to my church at Landsborough. And when I told him that I went down that night, he shook my hand and said it was absolutely horrifying what happened to the German line. And actually 10 aircraft were shot down that night of ours. They were shot down by night fighters. But we did destroy the target. Well, I just finished telling you about my experiences in Bomber Command in the war, and about Joe Herman, who went down on the one parachute with his bomb aimer, having been shot down on the period of my last flight also. And I come back to Australia and I volunteered to stay in for 2 years. Now Joe is still in England at that time, but I'm posted up in New Guinea and I fly around with 36 Squadron. They are disbanded, having been there in the war. And I go back up after they went to Townsville. I pick up on Dakota and go back to Port Moresby. I become the CEO of the Port Moresby airstrip, and I'm the chief of the 111 Air Sea Rescue with my Dakota. I can't land in the sea, but I can drop what they need. Then I go flow around to New Guinea and Rebel. My wife is bound to arrive in Sydney, and I go back to Australia. We get somewhere to live in Sydney. I'm still in the Air Force. I do 7 trips up to Japan, because we've now got an Air Force fighter squadron based in Japan, and we are the courier service to it. I do 7 trips to there, stopping on many, Point Cook, Adelaide, Alice Springs, Darwin and so on, Philippines, Okinawa, and then Japan. They put us up, except for the one I got through to Tokyo, put us up in the RAAF base at Iwakuni. And I've got a day off because the crew that went up before me takes the aircraft back and I stay. So I caught a train to Hiroshima. Up to that time I was calling it Hiroshima, but that's where they dropped the first atom bomb. I got off the train there. All the Chinese, I'm in Air Force uniform, that I pass, treat me with high respect. And Hiroshima was an absolute rubbish heap. The main street, which was a bitumen road, and they had managed to clear, and I walked up, and away up there's a concrete building standing, the only one. And on the side of that building is the shadow of a tram. The blast had burned that on the wall. It'll be there for all time. And a bit further up, a lady in kimono and a few sheets of corrugated iron. She's got stacked around. She's got a baby in a cardboard box. And she's there, probably doesn't know, maybe she won't live long. But she comes out, bowing down, and invited me to come have a cup of coffee. Well, I really didn't want to, but I had to. I can't understand her. She can't understand me. And I have 2 cups of coffee in their little cups. And she's got washing on her line. There's nobody else around. I imagine her husband's been killed in the war. And she wants to give me a gift. I refused that, but I did stay there and looked at her baby, and then I went on my way.
How long after the bomb was dropped were you there?
Well, I was in India the day they dropped the bomb, and they decided we didn't have to go anywhere else. We were back at Billsborough in India, and that would have been the tail end of 1915. 1915.
1945.
No, not 15.
44.
Yes,
45.
I left in England in 1915, didn't I?
2022.
And I got back to Australia at the end of that time after flying in India.
Yeah.
And when I did my time off, I went up to New Guinea, and that would have been the time, tail end of 1915 or 1916. Anyway, and then I did those trips up there and all over Indonesia and part of Malaya, Singapore, and my base was Batavia, which is now Jakarta, and I flew all over Indonesia, and I was carrying United Nations officials. They were about giving Indonesia back to the Dutch, back to the Indonesian, because the Dutch had occupied it for 100 years.
Yeah.
And after that I went home and straight into TAA.
So where did you start your career with TAA? In Brisbane here?
I was in Brisbane. I got back and was discharged from the Air Force at Amberley. So I went back to Amberley, brought my wife down and she went up to Monto, and I went, got a letter from TAA inviting me down as the Qantas, because I had written to them while I was still in the Air Force. I decided I wanted to stay home more than what Qantas would allow me, so I became a TAA pilot.
Flying DC-3s?
I was flying DC-3s because I was qualified on Dakotas, which was the same aircraft. I did a little bit of training with TAA before they let me go on my own again. I was living in Brisbane. They were doing a lot of work in Queensland. I've flown up all the towns up the coast. I've been to Charleville, Blackall, Longreach, Swinton, Cloncurry, Mount Isa, and Charlotte Downs. There was a cattle station, believe it. We actually landed there as an airline, and a little bit further out after another cattle station, and then Daly Waters, Catherine Darwin. That was our day flying. Turned around next day and come back. Anyway, that's it. And now I'm in TAA, the airline.
Can you go through the aircraft that you flew with TAA? What did you start on?
It's still on, is it?
Yeah, still on.
Yes, well, when they accepted me into TAA, of course I had to go back to down to Melbourne, and okay, with all the talking, we are now going to employ you. So they said, but we will want you to move down to Melbourne. I said, I will only become a TAA pilot if I go back to Brisbane. I will not move out of Brisbane. So obviously they were a bit short of crews at the time, and they let me go home. Now, I'd be stationed there, but I would do a short engineering course on the aircraft I have flown for a long time, and with a training captain, and then I can go back to Brisbane. I went down there for 2 weeks, and then from then on I went back to Brisbane, and I didn't leave Brisbane except to go down to Melbourne when I changed aircraft at different times to do a familiarisation of engineering and so on. I was lucky to get had just been built of fibro in Brisbane. My wife was still in Monto, and as soon as they let me go up in Brisbane, I was a permanent, and I started flying. In those days, the DC-3 was a frontline aircraft flying Sydney, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, and
So it was like the 737s are today, going between the cities. That's what the DC-3 was in its day.
yeah, I've been down to as far as Hobart in the DC-3s and up to Darwin in them, and I covered all those places. And so through having refused to go to Brisbane, I then missed out going on to Viscounts when I should have. So I ended up staying longer on the DC-3. Mind you, I eventually got on the Viscount. But I ended up with more flying hours on DC-3 than any other aircraft. And I became a check captain on DC-3s in Brisbane. For a short time, through Lotus Stars, I'd go up Brisbane, Rockhampton, Mackay, Proserpine, Bowen, Ayr, Townsville, switch over to a Lodestar and go Ingham, in as far as Cairns, stay a couple of days there while the next crew came up, and do that on the way back.
Yep.
Anyway, that only landed about, and lasted only 6 months when they sold the Lodestar, and I got to go to Holland to pick up a friendship, which meant going to Ireland, because they were the first to get them, and I got my wings on their airline. Went over to Holland, did a bit of the flying over the side of the sea, and that they had to get the hours up on the aircraft before passing from their hands. Visited their factory a couple of times, saw the aircraft they were torturing. They had a friendship on the rack. It was chains to the wingtip, to the tail, and so on. And this is going on for the rest of that aircraft's life. And it would always be ahead of any aircraft flying in hours. And if anything was going wrong, they'd pick it up there. Anyway, then I flew one out to Australia. And I flew on that for a year or so, all over the New South, Queensland and up to Darwin.
Was that the first friendship to come to Australia, was it, or?
It was the second.
It's the second. Okay.
I went over to get the first one.
Yep.
And I was to fly it after arriving in Australia at Darwin, take it down through Cloncurry, Townsville, Mackay, Rockhampton, Brisbane.
Yeah.
Because I'd done so much flying on threes in that, and they wanted it to arrive in Melbourne the same day as the 727 arrived.
Yeah.
And I think it was a Viscount. 3 of them arrived at the same time. Unfortunately, when my aircraft was due to go, it had still some problems. And me then became a pilot going up the middle of when I got away. The second aircraft wouldn't see that one, and I followed it. But I didn't fly friendships very long, but I was surprised one day when mind you, I became a check captain on the Viscounts too, on the friendship. I think I probably did a year and a half on the Friendship. And then one day the boss in Brisbane said to me, "Oh, you're going on to DC-6s." And that was a surprise. You know, a 4-engine aircraft, a big aircraft, and I'm in town, in Brisbane, and my reply to him said, "I won't move out of Brisbane." "Oh, that's all right. You're going to be a check captain on the DC-6, and you're going to stay in Brisbane." So I did a quick course onto the DC-6. Now, it's quite unusual to come onto an aircraft as a check captain, which I did, because they had a number of people they wanted to train onto DC-6s, and they couldn't do it down in Brisbane, in Townsville. No. So I stayed in Brisbane. I broke in about 6 people onto DC-6s over this short time, going down to Dubbo to do a lot of circuits. And I ended up flying to Perth, passenger flights, was getting hours up for the pilot I was training. I did quite a few flights up to New Guinea and Lae, and then I forget how long, but I did full check time on that. And I then went on to the Viscount, and after a few trips I was a check captain again. And I did about a year and a half from them. I left them to go on to DC-9s, and to go on to the DC-9 I had to go over to Hawaii, because they were the first flying them over there. And though we had a couple, they were too busy to do training. So I went up there, and with the United Airlines, and stationed in Honolulu. And during that time I did some a link trainer time with United, and I drove around up over the Rockies, and I flew to the island of Maui, which had a strip where I could do my training, and I didn't do much with a check captain on board, but but most of the training I did with them was night. But then I took the aircraft down and did some solo flying down at Maui. Maui's the island between Hawaii and the big island, the main island.
Did you have any passengers on board during that training, or was it? No. It was proper training, yeah.
Anyway, I was there only 2 weeks, and enjoyed the time in Honolulu. We had a unit paid for by the airline, and there were 4 other crews went over with me. But I went over and became a check captain, and we ate in very nice American cafes and that. Anyway, then I caught a flight from Honolulu to Los Angeles, where we were to catch a 747 flight from Los Angeles to Australia.
Might have been you flying it out.
Might have been.
And the surprising thing is that when we got to Honolulu, to Los Angeles, they said, you'll be delayed, because the aircraft you're going to fly to Australia on is still in London because of fog. So we sat in the terminal for 6 hours, living off them, moving around to see all the sights, and then a direct flight landing at Hawaii, and then on to Brisbane. And where was I then?
Coming back from Hawaii.
Yeah, but I've jumped to
What's that?
flying 747s, not 747s.
727.
727.
But I went up to a different airfield. But anyway, now I'm back in Australia flying
DC-9s.
DC-9s.
Yep.
And then I flew Electras.
Yep.
And then I went over to United, that's the one I was out of line on,
Yep.
to fly Electras. And then I went on to back on the 9s for a short while, and then on to 727s.
Yep. And the 100, you were on the 100 and 200 series. 727s, I would imagine.
I was, what did you say, 100s?
100 series. The 727 100 series.
200s.
200s, yep. And in the time that you were flying with TAA, did you have any memorable passengers? Someone that came up the front that was...
Well, the first one was when I was on 3s, a DC-3s.
yeah.
Our passenger from Rockhampton to Mackay, beautiful weather,
Yep.
was Artie Fadden. Artie Fadden was the Deputy Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Anyway, just about over Broad Sound on the way up, an engine failed. So with the knob on board, we flew one engine on to Mackay, having had to feather the engine, and then we had to wait there till another aircraft came up from Brisbane to fix the engine or change it.
Change it, yeah.
And of course he was busy electioneering.
Yes.
Anyway,
Yeah.
that was one when things went wrong. I flew a DC-3 service that went down through all those places to Cloncurry and then across to Tennant Creek.
Yes.
And that had some personages on board, and one of them was a very attractive young woman who took a fancy to me. I had to keep ducking around, and we had to overnight in Alice Springs. I only ever did that once, and she had a room next door to me, and I had to plead a long day flying today and tomorrow, and I can't stay up. But I had dinner with her, and but she was a nice lady and slightly handicapped in her leg.
Yeah.
And I had her up the front for a while
Yeah.
on the way back. And I was when Qantas gave up the flight from Brisbane to up to Darwin, the top pilots down in Melbourne came up to crew her, and with them was a couple of people with a title. Anyway, I went along as the in-between. I kept the books, I fueled the aircraft, and we did the whole flight with these people on board and back again. But we didn't bring the personages back, just the two Melbourne pilots. And of course they had done the flight, had me, because I was familiar with Queensland and Darwin. But Tennant Creek, Doug Tennant was one of the pilots, and he was a pilot with TA. I don't know whether you knew him.
No, I've heard
But
of that.
he operated out of Brisbane and up those stops, and we took over all that inland flying, and of course the very first aircraft through Queensland from Europe came down through there, and the big hangar in Longreach, which is now a museum for 747 and one other aircraft. On the front of that hangar was Qantas, Quantas, Queensland.
There's no U in Qantas.
Mm.
It's QANT, Queensland and Northern Territory Air
That's
Force
it.
Service.
And we took over the flight and the hangar and the
Yeah.
usual flights.
Mm.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I might have to end it there. I'm sorry, because I'm going to have to get going. My fiance's flight's making better time. Actually, I just checked the progress. So,
Right.
so thank you very much, Ron. For
I'll finish whatever
yep.
in the because overall, well, that was a quick run through with Qantas.
Yeah.
But the for Howard's benefit, quickly,
Yeah.
it's how you can get caught for things. Now I'm did fly Viscounts, and they did crash one up near Winton.
In Winton, yes.
But I got the job of taking 2 Mark 1s back to England.
Oh, right.
You know, 2 of them. But I got ready with a navigator and radio operator and all the rest of it. I was to go over, deliver it where it was built, and then go back and take the other one. And they rang up and said, "Oh, you don't have to go." And I said, "Why?" "Well, Mick Robinson Miller Airlines in Western Australia had a wing come off one of them. So they took away the Mark 1's license, so I didn't go.
Ah.